head to the Arctic now with Ambassador Mark Brzezinski. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Sweden, and he currently serves as the executive director of the United States Government Arctic Executive Steering Committee. While he was at the U.S. Embassy, he developed a new partnership with governments, diplomats, business, media, entertainment, environmental, and NGO communities to consider the link between what's actually happening in the Arctic and how that links to the rest of the world. Ambassador Brzezinski.
Thank you so much for that. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The Arctic. Harsh, cold, distant, remote ice. When I think of the Arctic, I think of openness and space. A place that only adventurous explorers, think Admiral Perry, would risk their lives, some giving their lives, to explore. Even now, only a small part of the Arctic is mapped and charted, and until recently, the Arctic was really just a place to conquer. Today, the Arctic is home to millions of people. Some iconic species, polar bear, walrus, can only live in the Arctic. The Arctic is also a refrigerator for the planet, and it is changing. We now know that we have underestimated the acceleration of that change. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to speak with you this morning about the impact of climate change in the Arctic within the region, the impact of climate change in the Arctic beyond the region, and what we can do together to address this growing challenge. And when I say growing challenge, what I mean is within your lifetime and that of your children, because of the impact of climate change in the Arctic. The basic outlines of human society are going to contract, creating haves and have-nots, and the potential of collision between them. That's the essence of the challenge we face, and it will take unprecedented international cooperation and self-sacrifice to address. It is a basic challenge to the human condition that will impact your generation. The map on the left of the world shows the Arctic at the tippy top, and it is in dark red because the Arctic is heating up twice as fast as the rest of the world, and in some regions of the Arctic, 4 times as fast as the rest of the world. This past winter broke all records in terms of a heat in the Arctic. The Arctic was 15 degrees warmer than average, and that was a record that broke the previous record set in 2015, which broke the previous record set in 2014. Higher temperatures mean receding sea ice. At the maximum extent, sea ice in March in the Arctic was the lowest on record, only beating the record set in 2015 and 2014 before that. And those two factors, higher temperatures, receding sea ice, are connected. They're connected because warming Arctic temperatures melt sea ice, which expose dark, open water, which absorbs the sun radiation even more, which heats up the Arctic, which in turn melts sea ice. Folks, that means the new norm in the Arctic will be breaking records. And who knows better than the people who live in the Arctic and whose history stems back thousands of years. I'm talking about the native and indigenous people of the Arctic area, the Inuits of Alaska, the Sami of Northern Europe. They are the people who can report to you earlier springs, later falls, floral blooms in the tundra unseen, algae blooms in the Arctic Ocean unseen. They have based their societies, a subsistence way of life, on hunting and fishing and understanding those patterns, whether caribou migration or salmon spawning or bird migration, which have been consistent over thousands of years until now. Animal populations in the Arctic are experiencing effects unseen ever before. You're not looking at pebbles on a beach here. You are looking at 50,000 walrus hauled out on a stony beach because the sea ice near one of their favorite feeding areas is no longer. When that happens, walrus trample their young. We're seeing all kinds of pernicious effects in terms of ticks. All Americans know about ticks. Ticks parasites have not been seen widely in the Arctic area. Now they are all over in some animals in the Arctic, and ticks carry parasites and diseases. We're seeing impacts on migratory bird populations and many other species that we are just beginning to understand. And the impact, of course, is not just on animal life. The impact is massively on human life in the Arctic area. You see, the sea ice historically has wrapped the Arctic coastline in an embrace in the past. And in so doing, it protected the Arctic coastline from erosion. And that's why, as you see the sea ice no longer, the Arctic coastline is literally whirling around. The Alaskan town of Kivalina, 50 years ago, was twice the size of what it is right now and will have to be relocated. That is traumatic to small communities in the Arctic, and it is costly to everyone. A town of 60 million minimum to relocate that town. We are looking at significant expense and disruption in the Arctic area. For 4 years, I lived in Sweden. And as ambassador, I went up to the Arctic more than 8 times to spend time with the Reindeer Herding Society of Northern Europe, the indigenous native people of the Arctic area of Northern Europe, to visit with them in their homes, to have meals with them, to go out to remote locations to bear witness to the impacts on climate change, on the central organizing fact of Sami life. And that is reindeer herding. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why the Arctic matters.
If this climate change keeps going at this rate, I'm pretty sure that the reindeer won't survive it. Yeah. It goes too fast right now. And without the reindeer, the whole Sami culture will disappear. And the world will be an indigenous people poorer.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's Nila Inga, a Sami leader in that part of Sweden that is above the Arctic Circle. And his warning is one we should heed. Because unless we get climate change under control and develop adaptation and mitigation approaches that work, our society too will also be in trouble. Our society too will be in trouble because what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. The Arctic is an augury. It's a forecast for what will happen in the rest of the world. The looming crisis in the Arctic is a tangible preview of the looming crisis of the global condition. And what is that? Let's start with wildfires. 2016 is bearing witness to a wildfire season unseen before. Here are pictures of smoke from Siberian wildfires last year floating over the Pacific Northwest. Of course, that means smoke pollution. It means a lot more carbon in the atmosphere. In Alaska, the fire season has expanded in terms of the number of wildfires by 2 times since the 1980s, and the amount of land area consumed has quadrupled. This puts carbon into the atmosphere, but also, so does this. The Arctic is underlain by soil called permafrost. Permanently frozen soil, permafrost, except it's no longer permanently frozen. The Arctic soil permafrost is thawing, and that is releasing previously trapped CO2 and methane that had been trapped in the frozen soil into the atmosphere. And if you look at the chart on the right, you see that the potential, there's a massive and an immense amount of carbon stored in the permafrost of the Arctic. If that is released, that will eclipse the carbon and methane released into the atmosphere by the burning of fossil fuels. And what does that contribute to? That contributes to sea level rise. What does that mean for countries close to sea level, like Bangladesh and Thailand, 1 meter above sea level, or Miami, a 6-foot rise in sea level, and with the melting of the Greenland ice sheet, you're looking at 27 feet. With a 6-foot rise in sea level, this is what happens in Miami. All of Miami Beach is gone. A 15-foot rise of sea level where you are right now in DC means the National Mall, the Capitol, National Geographic, where you are right now, is all underwater. There are things happening in the Arctic that we are just beginning to understand. Cold water absorbs carbon and holds carbon much more than warm water. Think of a glass of Coca-Cola. Glass of Coca-Cola will retain carbonization much more than a warm glass. And the cold water of the Arctic area, because of the carbon floating over it, is absorbing carbon and becoming more acidic. This is what ocean acidification does to shellfish. The shellfish on the right has been impacted by acidification. What that means for food security in a world in which the global population finds from fish 20% of its intake in terms of protein is what we are just beginning to understand. We're also just beginning to understand how the weather patterns of the world are impacted by what happens on the polar caps. There's something called the polar vortex, which is basically a band. It's where that red line is. It's a band of wind that keeps cold air bottled up near the North Pole until that band weakens. And when it weakens, the cold air pours south, and the Pacific jet stream, which is warm air, can be pushed north. That creates erratic weather patterns whereby, like on New Year's Eve of this year, we had above freezing at the North Pole, and of course we all remember Snowmageddon here in DC. Why does that polar vortex weaken? Because the Arctic Ocean, as it warms, radiates the heat that it takes in by melting sea ice in the summer in the winter, and that weakens the polar vortex. What studies are showing is that a summer that sees a lot of recession of sea ice sees a weakening of the polar vortex the following winter. Folks, what is it that we can do about this? Well, first of all, we absolutely, as a global community, have to execute on the commitments to national emissions reductions that we have pledged to. That will fall on your generation, the millennial generation, to see through those commitments when there is a lot of other strains on the globe. We need to more effectively deploy energy-efficient technologies, the financing of R&D pertaining to energy-efficient technologies so that we can deal some of the looming crises we face, whether it's sea level rise or wildfires or demise of species. But I will emphasize particularly to the millennial generation, there is something that you can do right now. I want to state up front that my generation has not yet acted decisively on climate change. Of course, we did COP21, which was a great step, but so much more needs to be done, which will fall on your generation. And the first thing we have to do is address the fact that too few people know about the Arctic and its link to the global condition. So if there's one request, one ask I have of you this morning, it's to share and share widely that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. What happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. If we can communicate that broadly, it is a step in the right direction. I am proud to work for a president who is the very first president to put his 2 feet in the Arctic. No previous president before Barack Obama visited the Arctic area, even though America is an Arctic country. I'm also proud to work for a president who believes in science. And when the president was in the Arctic in September last year, this is what he had to say.
We see record-setting drought in California, incredible wildfires in Washington, flooding just because the tides come in South Florida. Those are all potential indicators of the enormous human and economic costs that can come about because of climate change. And if we transition to a clean energy economy, then we still have time to do something about it. If we continue to deny the science or think that this is something distant in the future, it's possible that it could end up being too late.
When the president came back from the Arctic, he directed his team to run through the tape on the Arctic issue. So I'm pleased to report to you this morning that on September of 28th, in just a couple of months, the White House will convene the first ever meeting of science ministers from around the world on the topic of Arctic science. There has never been a meeting of science ministers from around the world with the goal of aligning our governments to cooperate more fully on Arctic science. The White House will convene that in September of this year, inviting, of course, Arctic countries, the Scandinavian countries, Russia, Canada, but also non-Arctic countries, China, Australia, Japan, because there is a global interest in what is happening in the Arctic. And a collective response is the most effective response. With that, thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
So it was fascinating. You touched a little bit about how important the Arctic is, but for people who still kind of think the Arctic is such a faraway place, why should I care?
Well, Rena, you should care because it directly impacts you in your own backyard. And it's really the generation that this generation's children will be that will feel the full impact on this. So if we want to think about our self-interest on the Arctic issue, think about your children and your children's children, because they will be the ones who are impacted by sea level rise, coastal erosion, erratic weather patterns, and pernicious effects, Rena, that we are just beginning to understand and see. It is important for us to get in front of this. The Arctic, yes, is distant and remote, but what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. It's directly connected to us in our own backyards. That's why the president went up there in September of this year to bear witness.
It was a 3-day trip last September. Syria is going crazy. The financial market is going crazy. How does the President of the United States justify taking 3 days and going somewhere so far and so remote?
Because, Rena, of the national security challenges that you mentioned, and of course they're important and they're central, we cannot underestimate how central to this generation that national security challenge is. And the value, as someone who works on the Arctic in the White House, the value of a president going to the Arctic when one of our needs is to communicate the Arctic cannot be underestimated. Where the president goes, you know this, the eyes of the world goes.
It's true.
And we need to bear witness to what is happening. And that's why I really tip my hat to President Obama for having done that. Yes, it's busy, no question about it, but it needed to be done. And as a result, since then, we've been able to focus attention on the climate issue to be inclusive of what is happening in the Arctic like never before.
You call it a national security issue. I've never heard the Arctic described that way.
It is a national security issue because of the impacts that we face, not right now, but for this generation. With the Greenland ice sheet melting, with the Antarctic ice sheet melting, with changes that I discussed in my presentation on ocean acidification, on erosion. These are things that we cannot let get in front of us. If we don't stay in front of it, then it will be shame on us in terms of reporting to this generation and the generation after that we did not do more to A, understand it, and by working with other countries, we can combine efficiencies, combine a range of engagement, combine a range of expense to bring together a better, more global understanding of what is happening in the Arctic. That's the goal of the White House Arctic Science Ministerial in September of this year, And that was the benefit of the president going to the Arctic. Yes, 3 days is a big chunk. It's expensive real estate on the presidential schedule. I'm so glad he did it.
I want to take a question from the audience here, and I want to remind everyone we're throughout the day asking for questions, and if you don't have one, you can actually vote on one that you'd like asked. And one here is, are climate change deniers an American phenomenon?
They're not an American phenomenon, and I would say that we actually have a communications challenge in front of us. You know, when you think about the Arctic issue, it's science, it's global, it goes to the heart of the economy. That's already difficult to communicate. People are already hitting delete. And it is an opportunity, I felt, very much to come before and stand before this audience, the millennial generation, the generation that really for the first generation ever communicates across boundaries and borders. And that is what it will take, because the Arctic issue is not going to be solved by one country. It's going to require a global approach. And the starting point for a global approach is communication. And that's what you all do fantastically. And so I am actually optimistic that when you combine our scientists and when you combine this generation's, the millennial generation's, ability to communicate and to connect beyond borders, this issue is something that we might not necessarily do get in front of it, but we can get in front of it, so I'm hopeful.
So my next question here was, is it too late to stop climate change?
Rena, I think some of the changes are irreversible. And so mitigation and adaptation, take the coastal erosion that I referred to. We are not going to bring back the sea ice. So what does that mean for coastal communities, whether in New Orleans or in Alaska? The fact is that I suspect that Alaska residents living on the coast will be America's very first climate refugees. And it is incumbent that we do something about it. So I don't think we'll be able to stop that. But there is still time to get in front of it. But it takes focus, and it will be expensive. To move a town is an expensive endeavor, and it is a traumatizing endeavor for that town's residents, and that needs to be taken on board as well.
You were ambassador of Sweden. How do we convince not only our country, but others that climate change is a real and a present danger?
By bearing witness, Rena, by showing the images of what is already happening to human life, to animal life, but also there's nothing that brings people together across borders like working together. The starting point of the Arctic issue is science. We all know that great science knows no borders, but the Arctic science as a discipline is something that needs to be brought together in a way that's pan-Arctic, not national programs, but programs in which we work together in constellations with other countries, Arctic countries, but also countries like Japan that have an ascending interest in the Arctic and that they themselves are investing in science. It's so exciting for me to see how Korea, China, India, Japan, Singapore have become important voices in Arctic science, in addition to the Americans and Canadians and Russians and Scandinavians. That is what we need to see.
And what's in it? Why are they so, I don't think of those countries as being involved in the Arctic. Why?
Take China, for example. China is being impacted by climate change just as we are. They want to get in front of it and understand what is happening better. Same thing with Japan. Korea is a great shipping country, and there are changes in shipping and maritime because of the melting of Arctic sea ice that will create opportunities that are not unlike the building of the Panama and Suez canals in terms of creating new sea routes, except nothing is being built. But it's the melting of the Arctic sea ice that is creating new passages for shipping and maritime across the polar cap. And it is incumbent on all of us, meaning the global community, to develop an alignment between friends and partners, meaning importers and exporters, on shipping and maritime in the Arctic so that it's not a disaster. So it's done properly in a sustainable way and in a way that's safe for the humans involved, for the populations that are there, and for the ecosystems that we are trying to preserve.
Whether Republican or Democrat, whoever takes over the White House in January, what would be your advice to the next administration?
My advice to the next administration is see what has happened under President Obama's leadership in this way. Under President Obama, for the first time, our country has a national strategy on the Arctic. And under that strategy, the president, by creating an Arctic Executive Steering Committee in the White House, has created a unity of purpose and a shared sense of the challenge and a shared sense of the opportunity on the Arctic issue like never before, meaning this: of all the many priorities we can have on the Arctic, the White House is now involved with identifying what priorities we are going to pursue and evaluating progress and milestones pertaining to those priorities. That is exactly what this issue needed. And so whoever is the next president, I think continuity, given the challenges and the potential vulnerabilities that we face, that should continue.
Ambassador Mark Brzezinski, thank you.
Thank you, Rena. Thank you.